So welcome to my SSLO story. And SSLOs are, that's an acronym for single set of learning objectives, which in my more new work with IETs in the last year and a half seems to be a place where we want to spend some time and focus, which is what we'll do today. So I am your facilitator, Kristine Kelly. I'm going to talk about a handful of slides in the beginning just to kind of ground us in this work. And then I'm going to turn it over to who we really want to hear from, which are three programs who are going to talk about their journey, give you some great examples of the work that they're doing and the SSLOs or some of the SSLOs they've been working with. So the basics, the actual programs you're going to hear from, and then we'll quickly wrap up with some information. So the basics. Patsy and I really like this and lead with this graphic because it really shows you where the SSLOs are in terms of these three areas. They really are this intersecting point. When we talk about IETs and the activities, the curriculum that we have with these IET programs, we are combining workforce preparation activities, we are combining adult education and literacy activities and numeracy, and also the workforce training activities. And these three pieces, they braid together, and what we get is our shared set of learning outcomes where each of these objectives clearly highlights each of these three areas. So that's what an SSLO is. And so again, we want to talk about how each of these objectives within this single set of learning objectives, this SSLO, specifies adult education content. So in that case, it would be something like the CCRS standards or the North Star digital literacy standards, the workforce preparation activities, which would be those professional skills, those ACEs, TIF skills that are so invaluable for our students. And then the workforce training competencies, which is what comes from your workforce partner or the workforce, the actual materials that students are using to learn that particular workforce training component. And these activities function cooperatively. So in the grand scheme of things, when you have your overall IET program goals, that's what sets the stage to sit down and really kind of flesh out your SSLO. So the SSLOs, or the single set of learning outcomes, it informs the skills and competencies for those three required components that we just saw on the previous slide. Then we think about the skills and the competencies that are needed, and that frames our integrated curricula. And then at that point, we go ahead and kind of that more granular level, and we actually develop that integrated curricula, the units, the lessons, and the activities that, that students are going to do. An effective SSLO clearly articulates what students will know and be able to do when they complete that IET program. And an effective SSLO also ensures that the instruction that students are receiving is aligned with those three required components that we talked about. And an effective SSLO also helps guide the development of those units, lesson plans, activities. So it really is the framework that guides everything we develop at that point. Patsy likes to call it the mashup. So this is one example of a graphic organizer that you can use. It is an example. And the three components that we talked about actually end up in four categories here. So we do that in order to really tease out those adult ed content standards from the literacy skills and competencies. We don't want to just list the CCRS skills, but we want to list the actual thing or things that students have to do as well. So the idea of this is to sit down and really take some notes in all of these areas, to have it kind of all in front of you so that you can synthesize these pieces into these statements of objectives that integrate those three component areas. Here's a great example, and this is actually an example from Minnesota from a parapro IET. And so the actual workforce training skill is to give clear verbal instructions. And so what the program did was thought about those adult ed literacy skills and competencies. So, being able to speak and sequence information and use precise language and adapt speech, because we're talking about, is this person talking to parents, to other teachers, to children? And the adult education content standards then are speaking and listening that match that sequencing of ideas, choosing words and phrases to convey ideas precisely, and this idea of differentiating between formal and more informal language. And so these are from those English language arts anchors. And then the workforce preparation skills and competencies. It was decided that this effective communication skill of choosing the appropriate register and for your audience, and then also the critical thinking skill as far as sequencing components, items, or ideas in a logical manner. So everything is out here. And an example of the SSLO that the program came up with was this one. So the idea of converse with and give verbal instructions to school-age children in clear, developmentally appropriate ways. So the fact that they have to be able to give verbal instructions and the clear, developmentally appropriate ways is what was synthesized from the idea of the contents, or the CCRS, as far as knowing your audience, being able to sequence and organize information, which also taps into those ACEs TIF skills of effective communication and learning, or not learning strategies, effective communication, sorry. So now we're going to get into, I think, what is the most exciting part of this, and where you're going to actually hear from three programs. And I'm going to facilitate through, and you are going to have an opportunity to hear some content from each program, and then a chance to ask some questions at the end of each program section. So with that, I would like to introduce DOC, Moose Lake, and their C-Tech program, which Patsy and I have learned a lot about. It's a really, in case you aren't familiar, I don't know if this is the first C-Tech IET we have in the state.
Hello, everyone. My name is Derek Aldridge, and I am the cabling instructor for C-Tech. C-Tech itself is a network cabling specialist program where they learn how to build infrastructure for cell phone, internet service, and all sorts of telecommunications overall in the field and the growing field infrastructure that we need in the U.S.
Matt Osmer, I'm the education director or supervisor in Moose Lake. And just kind of a reason why we want IET, and C-Tech was already a successful program, in part because we have a really good instructor, and in part because we used to have TABE requirements. Students used to have a 10 in math and a 10 in reading to qualify. Our assistant commissioner of education came in and said we would rather succeed inclusively, or we want to succeed inclusively and not fail exclusively, right? Or we don't want to fail, right? And so we wanted to up it and say, well, we can be good at both. We can include more people, give them more time to participate in the program, and provide them the support that they need. So IET has laid the groundwork for that. So students aren't having to wait longer to get into the program, and they're actually able to complete in a quicker fashion now with the supports that we have through IET. So I'll leave it at that. Kayla?
My name is Kayla Disterhob. I am the adult basic education instructor, part of the IET program in Moose Lake. And with those removed TABE score requirements, we were seeing some students that were previously ineligible for the class now being able to be successful while going through the IET of CTEC because of the added supports that the ABE and the workforce prep have provided to them throughout the program. So thus far, it's been working out really great for us as well as all of our students. We can go on to the next slide. So when we were developing the SSLOs for this program, we really wanted to look at where was the CTEC vocational curriculum lacking those ABE and workforce skills that the students were really going to need to be able to be successful when doing the work in the job. So we looked through, had a lot of conversations between Derek and I regarding what students needed for that job. And so the CCRS standards we implemented into our SSLOs in order to kind of have some backing and really create a guide for us to go off of when we were mapping out the activities and what we needed to do with our students. And then to take that a step further, we took the ACEs and TIF standards and aligned those in the workforce realm of what CTEC, some of those soft skills that the students were going to need in order to be successful once they got into the job. So we combined some CCRS standards and gaps with those ACEs and TIFs in order to model what we wanted our SSLOs to be like as we guided through the program. And Derek can speak to how we integrated both those ABE and workforce with the actual field expectations.
One of the things I noticed as the instructor teaching the course, the curriculum demanded that the students already had a high efficiency at arithmetic, reading, and writing, and the SSLO formulation was a call for that, so the students can be brought up to speed and be able to get through the material at a successful rate. Next slide.
So this was kind of one of our jokes about the SSLO development because we had a lot of meetings about it. It was new to the DOC, so we were really wanting to build a really strong foundation for the other facilities to kind of go off of. So we had a lot of discussion between myself, Derek, our program director, our supervisor, Hosmer, and then some staff down at central office, just so we were all on the same page of what the vision was going to be for the IET. And then in designing those SSLOs, we had great discussion, which I'll show on the next slide. This is just a little screenshot of actually one of our working documents that was, I think from the start, we had a lot of those group collaborative meetings where we would type up our thoughts, the SSLO concepts, some of the activities we maybe thought could go and be applicable. And these were just a tiny view at some of the notes and the workshopping that we did. There are many modifications. I mean, that's unfortunate to go through that when you're in it. But when you look back at it, all those modifications and reworks have just made those SSLOs and ultimately the IET program as a whole significantly stronger because we were able to have such a clear vision of what we needed to fill for ABE, what the vocational requirements were going to be, how we could best guide those workforce skills, and really just having that openness to make modifications to the SSLOs and ultimately the program in order to be successful.
One of our samples here for our SSLO is students will analyze cabling configuration needs and assemble necessary equipment for successful system functions. So in according with the CCRS standards, we want to take those mathematics and help those students with those math skills and explain why learning these math equations and learning these math strategies would be applicable in the real world so they can solve problems that may come across in the industry. So working one-on-one with students in both team settings so we can all work together with those ACEs and TIF standards in order to accomplish those goals and still students feel comfortable, even if they don't have a strong math background, in order to engage the material and solve problems that would occur in this industry of telecommunications.
And because everything was contextualized and made to be specific to CTEC and networking and cabling, the buy-in was there for the students because they started to see its relevance. And that was really probably one of the most important parts, is to make sure that the students understood and saw exactly where this was going to apply to their future careers. Next slide. So why have SSLOs? I'm going to speak about the ABE perspective for an SSLO. They really just provided me a structure, honestly, a roadmap for where we needed to take the IET program from the ABE and workforce side, because coming into it, I'm not an expert in networking and cabling. So being able to have those conversations with Derek, who is a content area expert, and figure out how we can best teach those students to also become content area experts and know all the background information that they needed to, allowed us to have a really clear vision. I think without those SSLOs, it would have been a lot more floundering and not as concise for us and not as beneficial for our students ultimately.
And from the vocational side, I can say that students that I have, now they remove the tape standard, are non-traditional students who may have not worked with math or any of the complex reading and writing that needed for the course. And for me to go back and teach them a whole new career and trade, and also cover the basics that may need refreshers or help with, it took a weight off my shoulders with having these SSLOs and disrupts help in the IET sense to help our students come up to where they need to be and be successful in their future and their careers. And that's all I have.
Great. So we have a couple minutes here for any specific questions or requests for clarifications from Moose Lake. You can put them in the chat box. Okay. You have a great job. You rock in the chat box. That's from Penny Pop. As you are thinking, if you have any questions, I think that a real big highlight for me, or what I'm pulling, is these are students who potentially could not have accessed programming because of tape scores that were not high enough, yet these are students that with the right supports and the right setup could be very successful. So these are students who potentially, if you kept the TABE requirement in place, would have missed out on a career pathway that they actually could excel at, correct? That's a really big deal. Question from Danielle, who initiated this partnership?
Do you mean the IET partnership or the partnership with CTEC?
Danielle, which? Both?
So maybe our supervisor Hosmer could speak a little more to it, because some of that happened obviously prior, especially prior to my coming on as the IET instructor. So Matt, are you on?
Yep. Yeah. So the push for it was Patty Pop, right? This was her wanting to contextualize not having tape scores as a requirement and wanting to ensure that guys can be successful, right? And previous to IET, we had what was called TPSE, transition to post secondary careers. And that was another step, right? So if they had a secondary credential, they gained their secondary credential, but their scores weren't high enough, or they came to the facility and they didn't, or they had a credential, but their scores, their reading and math scores were too low, they would have to take a class to qualify, right? And not everybody has that amount of time, right? So it's about pairing ABE with career tech and making it work and conceptualizing it so that there wasn't that extra step to get more guys through it. So central office for us, Patty Pop was a big proponent of wanting to get this off and running.
Heather, you had a question. What are the TABE reading scores for students? Was that your question, Heather?
Yeah, just to get an idea, because if you remove the scores, I'm thinking you still had to do TABE testing for other purposes, but it would be interesting for some of us who work with students who might be at the same level to know what were the TABE scores, if that makes sense.
Yep. So right now I'm looking at the current roster for the students we have. We have some with no scores. I believe our lowest current reading score is a 6. And the math is a 3. And previously in the last class, we did have someone who fell in the ESL category and ended up graduating and completing the program with very high marks. He did fantastic. Eliminated takes. We Laura, in regards to your question, I'm guessing we allow the students in based on their proximity to their release date. And maybe Aldridge could speak more to some of the other specifications for entry into the program.
So do a short pre-test, which they don't need any context or any prior knowledge to see their aptitude for the science or STEM-based career that this is. Also doing, interviews with them and seeing their interest and seeing how they would fit and give them options, as well as district ops doing an individual lesson plan with the students to help guide them along their journey following those standards.
I'm going to have to move us to Sauk Rapids, but thank you. Patsy and I have also learned a lot working with this particular CTEC program, on working with them a little bit on their SSLO. So thank you for that. And I think that the final highlight for me is that hearing that taking the weight off of the shoulders of a partner, that we all do what we do really, really well. And the ability to come together and be able to combine our areas of expertise. And one person or entity, it's difficult for one person or entity to do everything. So thank you for the great questions and for the presentation. Now I'm going to move on to Sauk Rapids and healthcare.
Hello, everybody. Meg here. This is Callie. I recognize a lot of the names of people who are here. So some of you have heard our story before, perhaps. So hopefully this is a different take on it. I'm the coordinator for the program at Hillside Adult Education in Sauk Rapids, and Callie is our lead instructor. We are located just upriver from the convention center where we used to all gather every August, and hopefully will again sometime soon. You can go to the next slide, please. We started working on our healthcare pathway through transitions funding, and during COVID, the MnSCU system, Min State system, formerly known as MnSCU, made their healthcare core curriculum broadly available to anyone. We had some time, right, Callie? So we took a hard look at that and thought that it really fit into our healthcare pathway. And at the same time, the state staff was starting to put this strong emphasis on IET. So we looked at our entire pathway and developed them into IET courses. We worked really closely with the largest healthcare provider in our region, which is Centricare. And let's see, they were one of the key pieces here, because their head of HR, which is the person we approached, had recently come up from Rochester, where we know they have some great partnerships with their ABE programs. He knew how valuable that relationship could be, so he welcomed us with open arms. And let's go to the next slide. There we go. And as a result, we too had a lot of meetings. Our meetings weren't really focused on the writing of the single set of learning objectives. They were more about establishing trust, making sure everybody knew everybody else, and drilling down to the right people who could help us with those learning objectives. Callie, why don't you take over the story with the next slide?
That's right. And I think that's where I met our partners at the local hospital, the nurse educators. And just backing up a little bit, I had worked in an adult career pathway cohort with Liz Andrus, and she had helped me develop a curriculum that was for, again, in our healthcare pathway for the lower level students, so that they could develop some basic skills around understanding health and earning their first aid CPR credential or certificate. And one of the joys for me as a teacher was seeing them succeed and get that credential. But just again, with any healthcare pathway, students need to have this basic certification. They need to be able to give CPR And often when you look at the requirements for a nursing assistant or any kind of entry-level healthcare, they require that training. So we offered that through our program. Okay. And then I met with the nurse educators at the hospital and I shared my curriculum with them. And it included the CPR first aid. It included some basic understanding about human body systems and terminology that would be very basic at the nursing assistant level. The nurse educators helped me understand that they really needed that anyone working in a nursing assistant role or any kind of entry-level care would need to understand medical abbreviations. And so that helped me to go back and look at my objectives and then rewrite them to meet what they were looking for. Okay, and so you'll see in a link here for our IET application. And if you, and I don't remember who's going to, just put that in the chat. If you click on that link, it'll go to a Google Doc that will show our completed IET application form. And that includes our SSLOs. It includes an idea. It just gives a deeper dive into that particular course. I also want to give a shout out to the Atlas website. You can look under adult career pathways, and the curriculum that I developed with Atlas is there also. So that may be a good resource for you if you're looking at an entry-level healthcare course. Go ahead and go to the next slide. That course is called Intro to Healthcare Careers, and it's for ESL level 4 and above. Okay, so this is an SSLO that was developed in partnership with our employer, local employer, looking at first aid and CPR as the focus. So the SSLO says that you would evaluate what is needed. So the student will evaluate what is needed and apply first aid and CPR knowledge in order to give appropriate treatment for injuries and accidents of different parts of the human body. Okay, I know that's a mouthful, but that encompasses the ACEs TIF standard of critical thinking 1 through 3. It also meets the CPR certification. It's part of meeting that CPR certification that's required by employers. And it's a critical thinking when you think about coming into an emergency situation. A student would need to know, what do you do? And a worker would need to know, what do you do in this situation? Okay, and there's another link here. The introduction to healthcare with CPR and first aid is also linked there. If somebody wants to copy in, if somebody wouldn't mind copying and pasting that would be great. Okay. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, please.
It sounds kind of easy, but Callie really sat down and we sat down together, but Callie did the yeoman's work of having all of those things in front of her and doing that mashup that Kristine and Patsy like to talk about, of all of those outcomes that we wanted. Challenges and successes we were asked to comment on. I think the biggest one was finding a willing partner. We had approached, for example, some nursing homes thinking, oh, CNA. And they really, they weren't so excited to have an ABE teacher on site, didn't think it was necessary. And we're happy to partner as long as what we were doing was sending them students. So they really just wanted another recruitment tool. I thought it was really important to leverage those workforce partners and employer connections and finding that right contact, somebody who really wants to work with you, I thought was the key to success. That's our story.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you again. I think we have 2 or 3 minutes here if you have any particular questions for
I'll put in a plug for
Here.
our highest level on our healthcare course, that healthcare core curriculum. Your students can enroll in it. It's open for statewide. Callie and an RN are co-instructors on that course. It's all asynchronous online, and your program can earn 90 hours of contact time. Check it out. Call me up.
Well, that's awesome.
Right. This isn't about that. This is about single set of learning objectives.
That is an IET course also.
So any questions for them? It's interesting, as you might be thinking of questions. I was recently at COAB and attended a day of IET training. And it, as you just heard, it's not necessarily easy to find partners, but if there is a need in your community that you want to fill, and it is a need that you have zero knowledge of, a career pathway, say CTech, for example, it's necessary to find that partner so that you can provide programming that you feel comfortable with, obviously, and you feel, that you have a knowledge of, but that also is a need in the community, which, so you kept looking for healthcare partners until you found them. We have a go man. Oh yeah, Mankato. Yep. If you're not looking at the chat box, that statewide healthcare course looks awesome. Very creative. So thank you for suggesting that. Meg also put her email, and I know that any of the presenters today are willing to answer questions if you have questions after this session.
I'll put in one more plug for the healthcare core class. Not only can you earn 90 hours, your students can earn up to 4 college credits. You don't pay anything for it. They don't pay anything for it.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's an IET. So when the state or the feds come around and say each program must offer an IET, you can say, we're making the healthcare core available to all of our students.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
It's a win-win-win. It's a win cubed, according to Karen. There is a question from Allison. Is there a cost for the HCCC asynchronous platform?
No, that's really being covered by transitions funding. So we keep the hours that we generate from our students, but if you enroll a student in there, you get to keep all the hours. No cost to anybody. Now, when the students go to get the credits put on their transcript, they have to be enrolled on a campus. So, what does it cost? $20 to actually enroll, I think, on most campuses. So there's that cost eventually just to get into the MinSCU system, essentially.
Well, thank you for that presentation on your healthcare IETs. We're going to hear from one final program, International Institute of Minnesota. And I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. And yes, thank you very much. Got a big thank you from Astrid. I think it's just so important for us to hear directly from the programs and kind of the nuts and bolts of how you're putting things together.
Hi, yes, I am Lynn, Lynn Thompson from the International Institute of Minnesota. We are located in St. Paul. My program is the Hospitality Career Pathway. And in our program, we are really looking at helping those with the lowest literacy levels, very new to the country and looking for maybe their first job in the US. And so that's a little bit that sets us apart from the other two programs that presented before, that our students have are really needing those, not only the job skills, but just the workforce training, the understanding the cultural dynamics of working in the US, along with those basic literacy skills and how to communicate with their coworkers, with customers, and their supervisors as well. So we have 3 steps in our pathway. The first one is the housekeeping training. which started out as mostly just in hotels, but we've expanded to training students in hospitals and nursing homes. The picture you see there is from Children's Hospital in St. Paul. And then our dietary aid training, which is a great entry-level position for somebody looking to get into healthcare, but also can move into other food service, nutrition, cook, all kinds of different pathways that students can get into from the dietary aid job. So go ahead and go to the next slide. And so we've kind of seen various depictions of this equation here, combining the workforce training. So we already had the housekeeping and dietary aid curriculum mostly developed when we made our single set of learning objectives. And so we were looking at just combining those outcomes with the workforce preparation activities from the CCRS and the ACEs and TIF and North Star. And then all of the other just soft skills that come along with the workforce training. So we also integrate being prepared for the job and how to interview, how to write a resume, all those other soft skills that people will need to work in the US. Go ahead, next slide. So here's an example from our dietary aid class. The learning objective is to be able to describe dysphagia, its causes and its risks. So again, kind of like Callie talked about, is taking all of those skills that a student or an employee may need to know on the job, and then adding in the critical thinking and the language skills. So this correlates with the reading anchor number 2, integrate and evaluate information presented in diverse media and formats, including visually, quantitatively, and orally. And then the SSLO that we come up with really is just like Patsy said in the beginning, mashing up those objectives so the student will be able to determine central ideas or themes of reading in dysphagia and summarize the key supporting details and ideas. And we see these objectives as really the building blocks for what they'll need in the future as they continue in their career. We always want to motivate students to continue growing and learning. So if we can help them to have these academic skills from the very beginning, it's really, really important. I always say that, you know, you're going to get training on the job, and a lot of the things that I teach in my class, you're going to see again in the training on the job, but we're going to slow it down for you and help to really explain all those little intricacies along the way that people who have not grown up in the US or haven't worked in the US before just won't understand or see. So my second example comes from our job club portion of the class, where we want students to be able to talk about their past work experience and current qualifications. So that's the tell me about yourself question. And so that's a skill that they'll need throughout their working life. And then the CCRS anchor that correlates with is the speaking and listening anchor 4. And I think what's been interesting to see in all of these different presentations is kind of how we present our SSLOs, the different formats, and there's really not one right way to format it. And I think that kind of freed me up at the beginning when I was writing my SSLOs, was just like, however makes sense to you, as long as it has all those 3 key components, that's really what they're looking for. Go ahead on the next slide. All right, so this final one kind of incorporates the CCRS and the TIF, just showing all those things written out. And this one is from our housekeeping training, where we want students to be able to use appropriate phrases in asking for help and directing guests to the appropriate help. And this really helps in students being able to advocate for themselves and to know the questions that guests might be asking them and how to ask for help for themselves. So that really gets into that TIF, effective communication skill. So I can go into the next slide and talk a little bit. Oh, so sorry, this is the final SSLO that came out of that one, that students will be able to apply the knowledge of language to understand how language functions in a variety of housekeeping workplace scenarios and seek clarification respectfully, as well as express and acknowledge expectations. So my process, I did not have a lot of meetings, but the only way you can get out of having a lot of meetings is do it yourself. So it really was just me sitting in a room, all of the learning objectives from my curriculum, all of the CCRS standards, all the TIF standards, everything laid out, and just doing a matching exercise. Where do these match up and correlate, and how can I write this learning objective so that it incorporates all three of those pieces? We had gone through some professional development as a staff where we met once a month for 6 months going through the CCRS standards. So I felt like that was a really good basis for understanding those standards and how they can enhance the learning objectives that we already had. And then I did watch several webinars on how to write SSLOs. And so any of you out there watching right now, you're on the right track. That's what you need to do. And then I was just the program manager that was dedicated to writing them. Go on to the next slide. The most helpful thing for me is to work with employers and to ask lots of questions about how they use their employees, what the job responsibilities of an employee is going to be. And just reading the job description is not enough. It's really helpful to go into the workplace, observe the housekeeper, the dietary aide, ask questions of the manager, use the materials that they have. So gathering menus or meal tickets or room lists, the actual materials, that's the chemical labels, all of those things are really important to making the learning very useful. And I think that's what the CTEC people said too, was that students really appreciate the learning and the knowledge much more when they know it's going to immediately be beneficial to them in the workplace, and they can see how that is going to happen. And then assuring that lessons in teaching are, they're teaching both the job skills and the English language at the same time, makes it richer learning for students. And it's also essential for all those grants out there that we want to get. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much all I had to share. So if there's any other questions or comments.
So any questions in the chat box? I do have a question. So we're hearing some different models. We're hearing a model where or models where the partner, the employer, is really at the table. And then in this case, you already had something that was very concrete and established. And a big key was kind of embedding those TIF and CCRS standards. So in that case, you're able to do the work, the mashup yourself.
Yeah. So I think we did get a lot of input from employers in the beginning to write the original curriculum, and then, but it was kind of a backfill, I think, with the CCRS and TIF standards.
That's why this is such a great example, because you actually started with something and then move forward with that, as opposed to the model of starting from scratch. So it's another great example of where your program, depending on where your program is, the pathway you might take to doing this work. Any questions or comments? We've just got a couple minutes here. Great on time, all presenters. Ron has a question. It seems like much of the SSLO work is cross-referencing ACEs, TIF, CCRS. Is there a document that does that legwork?
I think that one of our staff, our colleagues, kind of took all of the CCRS standards and broke them up into kind of a Excel form and listed them all out. And that was helpful to see it in that format. I think the CCRS standards are written in a book somewhere. And so having it digitally to be able to manipulate and move around like that was helpful. I think the TIF standards are more written in book form as well. So it could be a helpful resource.
It's handy to have someone at the table who really knows those different standards. And I know that's why Patsy and I have been working with some programs and willing to kind of step in. And when SSLOs have been created to say, you know, to kind of offer some coaching. And sometimes it's because we just can say, oh, absolutely, that's CCRS, you know, reading 5, you know, or a TIF ACEs skill. And one of the great things is that it doesn't have to be 10 CCR standards, right? You may have just one that really is targeted with that SSLO, and that's completely okay. Well, a couple things here. Thank you, Ron. Atlas is, and that's because we are in touch with amazing people around Minnesota who can help us to support programs. Quickly, IET playlist on the YouTube channel. Check it out, binge it. It's great. Mighty Networks, the ACP group. And I know that Heather posts things, and we're, you know, and you can post things, questions. We've always got somebody eyeballing it. IET resources on the Atlas site, and there are going to be more soon. Very, very quickly, I took a couple snips, and we are going to be adding more to the SSLO section here. So you go to the resource library, Adult Career Pathways, Integrated Education and Training, and then it's a general IET and single set of learning objectives. One of the things that we've been talking about is if multiple programs, for example, are doing the same industry area, should anyone have to recreate the wheel, or can we be posting SSLOs that other people can draw from and adapt? And so be looking for more resources. Thank you everyone for attending. I think the flyer is going to go, a link to the flyer. Do we have that, Astrid?
Yep, it's been added.
That's a great question, Penny. And of course we had a retreat yeah. And so as I said, keep an eye, and I'm sure that when we gather some of these things, something will be in the Min ABE Connect newsletter, as well as in Mighty Networks. Gail has posted the link to the flyer, and the next session begins
At 2:30.
2:30. Thank you so much to all the presenters. It's so great to see a variety of approaches to this type of programming. Thank you.